hot. It's very hot.
Okay.
It is late May, about to be June, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 186 of the Mike Colón podcast. You know, Bananarama had a song back in the 80s called "Cruel Summer," and this day kind of fits it. And I love the summer. It was about 90 earlier today. It's now dipped below that, but we're not here to do weather. Anyway, if you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was 185. That was volume 18 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite retired Special Operations Command Chief, John Norman, was here. John talked about his 28 years in the FD and also the tall task, but ultimately successful task of rebuilding the FDNY Special Operations Command after 9/11. Of the 343 firemen who perished that day, 95 were from SOC, but they were able to rebuild, and he took us through that. So special thanks to him for coming on. And tonight should be an interesting show with my next guest. You know, the NYPD's Office of Public Information is one of the busiest press offices in the world. His volume of work second to only the White House, and my next guest was certainly well prepared to handle it while he worked in it. A lifelong New Yorker, of course, his career in its press corps is both lengthy, and distinguished, with stops at the New York Post, Newsday, New York Daily News, ABC, and NBC. He gave you an up-and-close look at crime and terrorism through the eyes of those who fight it. An author, it was with Ted Gerstein, and he published what's arguably the definitive account of the NYPD bomb squad, which is, of course, the 2006 classic Bomb Squad, a year inside the NYPD's most exclusive police unit. And that's Richard Esposito, who joins us tonight on the Mike Colón podcast. Rich, welcome. How are you?
I'm great, Mike. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. We've been working on this for a while. So here you are, like I said, on this last day of May, the 31st. So the first question is an easy one. Where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in Manhattan in East Harlem, which, was a quiet neighborhood. Harlem was, the world was a little different back in the 60s, and it was a poor neighborhood. But, you don't know that when you're, 8, 9, and 10 years old. You're just having fun. So that's where I grew up. And, from there I went to school in the Bronx, to Fordham High School, and then college in Manhattan, NYU. Worked on the student magazine, worked on the high school newspaper. And so I guess you could say I started doing this, like many of us, when I was like 12, when I first wanted to become a journalist,
Richard Esposito is our guest tonight. I will say, for those of you that might have a question for Rich, fire it away in the super chat, in the live chat, I should say, and you're encouraged to do the super chat. If you want to contribute any monetary value to this show, please do. I'm not going to say no, as you would know. I'm not one to reject that. So tell me, I noticed you said it really started when you were 12. A lot of kids, I know I still do this, will buff the scanner. We'll listen to the police scanner. We'll listen to the fire scanner. I remember John Miller, our mutual friend, telling me he used to ride his bike to these crime scenes. So was that you? Was it a certain story? Was it seeing something in your own neighborhood? Why 12?
No, when I was that age, I started reading the famous journalists from the past, the famous writers from the past, whether it's A.J. Liebling or, believe it or not, Ernest Hemingway before he became an author. He worked as a reporter for the Toronto Star. I grew up in a neighborhood where, if you recall, in the 60s, there were riots in Harlem, and there was a heroin epidemic. And I got interested in these kinds of stories, the stories of people, the stories of their lives, and the telling of those stories. Who are these people trapped in this world? And what are the stories that they can't tell themselves? And that's kind of where my interest began. And as you know, there are two sides to that story. There are both the people and the people who happen to be in law enforcement, who also are part of that working class blue collar audience that I really care about. And that's kind of how I got my start, Mike.
Interesting. Shout out to our friends in the live chat, Steven Zaslavsky, who's a commissioner down here where I'm at for the New Haven Fire Department, Mark Mulitz, retired NYPD sergeant, and Bill Ryan, detective first grade, retired out of the NYPD's Arson Explosion Squad. Thanks, guys, for tuning in tonight. So as far as the education of a journalist, you can't start in a better place than I think, than NYU. You also assisted Berkeley as well. So going to those two institutions, great lessons to be learned in both. What were the pivotal lessons you took from both that influenced your work early on?
Well, that's kind of funny. So when I went to NYU, my most influential professor was, believe it or not, he was the Shakespeare scholar. But what he always said was, keep your eye on it. Keep your eye on the main chance. And what he meant was go where the action is, go where the job is, and take it and go forward. And it was great advice. When I wanted to go to graduate school, I said, I don't really know where I should go. He said, drive around for a little bit. When you get to a place that you want to be, drop me a postcard and I'll send them a letter. So I got to Berkeley and I really liked the department there. And I was fortunate and I got into Berkeley, one of the greatest schools in the country. It's a state school that, is probably better than most Ivy League schools, if not all of them. It's a great place. And I try to get back there once a year. How they influenced me, I worked on the student magazine at NYU. Believe it, I covered arts and not crime. And at Berkeley, I hustled my way to get little pieces in the Bay Area Guardian, a local alternative newspaper. And I mean little pieces, like many of us. But what really happened is there was an opening as a copy boy at the New York Daily News. And that was that. Goodbye graduate school, goodbye California. Off we go to learn how to buy coffee for people, pick up newspapers, carry them on your shoulder, get on the subway, run downtown, pick up the mail, bring it back to the office, and learn everything possible about journalism from the ground up, including here's how you write it, kid. Here's the way we tell stories. Here's how short a sentence should be. Here's why we don't use adjectives and why the word murder doesn't need the word brutal in front of it, because they all are. And why, if you can write a sentence without a comma, you're writing the way people. The Daily News really taught the fundamentals of how to write like people talk. And it was great. I got there as a copy boy. The copy boy bench at the Daily News was filled with talent, people who came from all over the country and who made careers all over the country. But they all started out the same way as apprentices, sitting next to people who gave you tough jobs to do. And it was great. And so that's where, if you ask me what it was and where it wasn't NYU so much, it wasn't Berkeley so much, it was becoming a copy boy at the New York Daily News. And I don't know if you've ever seen the building that the Daily News used to be in, but when I was a young reporter, it was on East 42nd Street. The UN was down the block. But when you walked into the Daily News, there was a globe, gigantic globe, like 9 feet high, 9 feet wide, rotating slowly. And there were clocks from around the world and a marble floor with meridians showing you all the different parts of the world. And you walked in there and you said, this is where I want to be. So it was pretty exciting.
It's in many ways the heartbeat of the city, and that's missed. I now, and it broke my heart to read a few years ago when the Daily News was sold. It was sold for $1. To think that either one of us could have bought the New York Daily News if we wanted to for $1 is heartbreaking. And the institution that it is, I think a lot of people now that either aren't history buffs or of my generation, a little younger, they forget just how much that paper meant. And just how much the bylines in a paper like that meant, not just yours. Think about it. I've had Mike Lupica on this show. Think of the imprint that he has put on that paper. He's still there writing as a freelancer these days, granted, but still writing. Obviously, the late, great Pete Hamill. Of course, you talk about a writer like Jimmy Breslin. So you're walking into a newsroom of giants. And I imagine there were days where you just pinched yourself and said to yourself exactly what you just said. Man, not only do I want to be here, but I'm glad I'm here.
It was, you walked down the hall and there was Jimmy Breslin, Earl Caldwell, Pete Hamill, and that's just the starting lineup in The Columnist, and you're looking at that and you're like, this is an amazing place and I am so fortunate to be here. And they were so generous with their time. Mike, I'm plugging something in, so forgive me for a second. There we go. So that I don't lose you. Then you had these editors and these rewrite men, the national correspondents at the Daily News. They weren't these giant bylines, but they were these giant writers. And you'd watch, they'd just sit down, they still use the typewriter, they'd put the paper in, and they'd start typing. And out it would come, and that's what would go in the newspaper. That's how clean these people could write. Wonderful to see. And a new generation of reporters was coming in. The Daily News got its first African-American city editor at the time. The role of women in the newsroom was growing. They brought in some younger women reporters who were fantastic court reporters. And they groomed the young people like me at the time. I was like 21. They tried to find the place where you belonged. In my case, it was a crime writer. In other cases, it was the arts and entertainment section or the sports section. But whichever of these sections, you went to sports, there was guys like Lupica. Before Lupica, there was Bill Gallo, the great cartoonist. It was you went to the editorial page, Mike, and there were these people who had spent their whole life thinking about what really mattered to people and to say it in a way that people really understood it. Powerful headline writers, and you just watched. This was the newspaper who, when I was still out in California, did Ford to City drop dead when the president of the United States didn't want to help New York, and where other newspapers were saying, men walk on the moon, the Daily News was man walks on the moon. And they just knew how to hit home with their writing throughout. It was a great place to work, in just about every way.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, you started out at the paper as officially as a reporter that produced the iconic headline, Headless Body and Topless Bar, that being the New York Post from 1983 to 1985. And it certainly had its own rich history and still does to this day, of writers, especially crime reporters. Murray Weiss was there forever, and he certainly made his print as an example. He was recently on this show. So you're walking there during a time in which, as I covered before, anybody that was a cop during the 80s, anybody that was a crime reporter during the 80s, your nights, your days, they were always busy because, unfortunately, there were so many victims to go around. But you were in your element. Now, but I'm curious about it. Before I dive into getting to the Post itself, I covered this with Rocco Periscindola when he was on, too. Great crime reporter for the Daily News. 3 different police departments. So subway crime, you would talk to the transit police. Housing crime, well, talk to the housing police. Anything else, the NYPD. From that standpoint and learning how the 3 different police departments work, the politics and how they how they investigated crimes. Tell me about that first.
That was really interesting. There was a little period when I was a reporter for the Daily News before I went to the Post, and a little period where I really cut my teeth. I went to Philadelphia, where I was the police bureau chief for a newspaper that's sadly no longer with us, the Philadelphia Bulletin. Then you get to the New York Post, which had great relationships with law enforcement. And you have these 3 police departments where the radios didn't necessarily talk to each other. The subway transit police, their radios didn't work sometimes. And so there they are, underground, alone. But you had to learn the culture of each place. The subway cops, they rode down there alone. There was graffiti on the trains. There was crime on the trains. And then there are the people above ground. And they are the people we knew as the New York City Police Department. And then there are the people who did the vertical patrols, the housing cops. Every step up a stairway was filled with danger for them. Each of them had their own culture. Each of them had their own challenge. And you had to learn how each of them ticked, what made them tick. And when there was a crime like Bernie Goetz, that was the police department. When there was a shooting in the subway, that's when you had people like Bill Bratton say, it's time to stop using revolvers. We need to get to 9mm handguns because that's what the criminals are using. Remember, before he became police commissioner, Bill Bratton was like the General Patton of the subways, and he went down there and he really shaped up the police department in New York City's transit system. So that's a little bit about how it felt. You had to go down there, meet the chiefs who ran the subway cops, learn what's on their mind, what their concerns were. Radios was a huge concern of theirs. Then go to housing and understand what the housing police faced. Many of the things they faced had to do with the conditions in the city's housing projects. And then you go upstairs and there's the police department, this sprawling city. Detectives in Queens are completely different problems than detectives in, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, or the disorder unit up in the Bronx, where they, get prepared for disturbances, completely different than the bomb squad. And it's a huge undertaking to learn the New York City Police Department. It takes time, it takes patience, and nobody suffers fools gladly in that world, but they do have the time, if you care and they know you care, to educate you as to their agencies. And people like Murray and Rocco that you talked about, they're not pushovers. Willie Rashbaum at the Times. These are guys who, like myself, we know most cops are honorable people doing honorable work for a good city. And when we find something bad, we tell those stories too in that context. And everybody respects that when there's something, whether it's, a corruption case or somebody who gets caught drunk driving or somebody has a relationship that's inappropriate, that good reporters will tell those stories too, but they'll tell them fairly. And that's one of the things that happens when you come to people face to face, and you don't work on the telephone, but you work in person. Murray was at police headquarters every day. So when Murray wrote a negative story, the next morning he came to work and he had to look those cops in the eye. So he had to be prepared to defend his story. Rocco does that every day. And, that's the world that a good reporter should live in. So that's a bit about the police department. Remember, it's 54,000 people. Right now, there's about approximately 36,000 cops and 19,000 civilians. That's a big agency. That's a lot of ground to cover for a reporter. And that's what people like Rocco do. That's what people like Larry Salona does at the Post, who's been a police reporter for decades now and really is well regarded. That's what, Willie Rashbaum at the Times did. And Tony DiStefano, who's at Newsday and doesn't cover the city as much anymore, but Tony's 70 now, and he still loves to cover cops and courts, and he's really good at it.
Yeah. I mean, it is essentially the soul of a city transmitted through a newspaper, because, as I've covered before, both for the police department miniseries and for my fire department miniseries, it's a city that bleeds through its fire department and police department. It's a city that succeeds through its fire department and police department, because those are the telltale signs of either a city that's thriving or a city in distress. Think of Dennis Smith's report from Engine Company 82. What was that? A city in distress through the eyes of South Bronx firemen. What were the 80s and the early 90s, through your reporting as well as others that we've talked about off air and on air. Stories of a city in distress through the eyes of its beleaguered police departments, doing their best, but running into problems either bureaucratically or outward in the terms of the stories of the time. So you mentioned Bernie Getz, and before I get to him, Brian Coughlin, sergeant in the NYPD bomb squad's tuning in tonight. Hi, Brian. He says, Rich is a true gentleman enjoying the show. Sarge, I have to say this, I think if I'm not mistaken, he started out as a housing cop before the merger. Housing, are you on the air? So to your point on the radios, he'll probably know what I'm talking about there. Hope you're well, Sarge. But as far as Bernie Getz, I mean, people now forget, at least that weren't around in New York during that time, forget just how crazy a story that was. To some at first, he was a hero. Now, as more details have come out, people kind of realize he's a bit of a wacky character, to say the least. So covering that story as it was hot in the pan, at a time in which New Yorkers were collectively saying, as we've just discussed, enough when it came to crime. From your perspective as a young guy at the time, just starting out, what was it like?
You hit on the divides in our city that story captured. There was enough of this crime, and here's somebody who fought back. That was one element of the Bernie Getz story. Another element was, who is this guy who shot a kid in the back on the floor of the subway? And then for someone like me working for the Post, the way the Post worked was, hey kid, Bernie Getz lives in this building. So I went, it was snowing. I stayed in front of that building for 2 days, and I called at one point and said, hey, am I going to get relief? And the editor at the Post said, yeah, we'll let you know. Goodbye. So Bernie Getz was an all encompassing story for the New York Post. There was no picture of Bernie Goetz at the beginning. There was who is this guy? What did he look like? I was able to get a photo of Bernie Goetz that I raced back to the Post, and that was a big contribution by me for a new guy. For them, here, this is the picture that you can put on the cover of Bernie Goetz. So what it was like was you were right there in the middle of the biggest story of the moment. He had, I believe it was Barry Slotnick was his lawyer, and Barry Slotnick had his own relationship with the New York Post where he could call the editors whenever he needed to. There was a knee-jerk reaction to Bernie Goetz was what we needed. These kids, enough of these roving wolf packs. And there was some truth to that, but it's always, there's like three sides actually to every story. The kids were also human beings. And one of those kids was, handicapped for life. And I went to the housing project where those kids lived, and I went into the housing project and I climbed those stairs and interviewed those kids. The world they came from is not an easy world. That doesn't justify anything they did. It justifies nothing at all. But when you stop and you say, did Bernie Goetz have a shred of compassion in him? Did Bernie Goetz have any understanding? Was Bernie Goetz just a scared, skinny guy with a gun? I tried to talk to him. I followed him through the village later in the story just to try and understand Bernie Goetz. And I think to this day, no one really understands what makes Bernie Goetz tick and what happened at that time. There were so many cases in the 80s and early 90s, but particularly in the 80s, that sort of ripped at the fabric of New York City. I went to one case, not in any way like Bernie Goetz. It was a mother who was killed in the housing projects down on Avenue D between 12th and running down on the east side. And if you know Manhattan, it's all the way by the East River, the Lower East Side. And there was a bloody handprint on the door. And I asked the chief of detectives for Manhattan at the time, Aaron Rosenthal, what happened, Aaron? What happened, chief? He said, what happened is the mother refused to let her have sex, this 14-year-old girl, with her boyfriend. So they killed her, and they dragged her, and she tried desperately to get out the door, and that's her fingerprints as they were killing her. I said, why would you kill your mother? He said, sometimes evil is just banal. It just can't be explained. And that is the kind of crime that tears at a city. She was a kid. Why are you killing your mother over this? He was a boy. Why are you killing her mother over this? But those things pile up on a city. We're seeing a case of that now in New York. It's by no means whatsoever what it was like then. It feels bad and it looks bad and it is bad, but it's not 2,000 homicides, several 100,000 car thefts, burglaries, on and on and on. It's far more peaceful city than it was back then. And I picked that crime because that is more the kinds of things you saw on the street. Bernie Goetz captured that moment. That's what he was. He was like a lightning rod for all of this kind of terrible crime that you saw everywhere at the time.
And I feel like for crime reporters then, and for police officers then, as many of my friends in the chat can attest to, you were operating within a war zone. Now, sometimes, as you mentioned, you were growing up. Was it an easy neighborhood to grow up in terms of the financial situation? No, but when you're a kid, you don't realize that. It's a lot different when you're upfront and personal with this stuff, because, as you said, some things you can't explain. Why do you walk? I mean, for example, the Michelle Go incident from a few months ago. Why do you just walk up to that poor woman who's minding her own business and shove her to her death in front of a train? You don't know. Why did that guy come in from Baltimore a number of years ago and execute Lou and Ramos as they sat in the patrol cars? You don't know. And sometimes you'll never be able to know, because the people that do these things, either, as you said, are so banal in their sinister ways, that they're never going to give you a proper explanation. And sometimes, in the case of Ismail Brinsley, or in the case of the person that shoved Michelle going from that train, they're so mentally gone, or they take their own lives, you're never going to get a definitive answer.
No, you're not. And if there's any agency that bears the brunt of all of these kinds of things, it is the police.
Yes.
And very often the same people who criticize the police then don't want to defund the police, say that the police are not necessary in our society, are the very same people who say, why didn't you catch this guy? Why didn't you prevent this crime? Now, police can't prevent every crime. They can solve a lot of them.
Yeah.
They can clear a lot of them. People don't see the crimes that police do prevent, and there's quite a lot of them. People don't see the positive impact police have, whether it's on a basketball court or in a community council meeting or just mentoring a young kid. There's a chief at the New York City Police Department, Chief Jeff Madry. Chief Madry's known one of the detectives who worked for him since he was 14. His mother dropped him off at the police station and said, here's my kid. I have 2 jobs. You look out for him. He loves cops' cars. And he became a police officer, became a detective, and Jeff Madry mentored him all along. But what I'm getting at is there's the stopping crime part of police work, very hard, and you can't stop them all. You can't predict when a homeless person who needs mental care is going to push somebody in front of a train, and you can't be at every train stop, no matter how you flood the system. You can't understand why some guy walks on a train and shoots a stranger, a nice man, and then drops the gun off in the hands of a homeless person and keeps going. Unpredictable, unlikely to ever stop a crime like that. You'll catch the person. They caught the person fast. But police are what keeps the fabric of the city together. And there's just anybody who covers law enforcement and pays attention to law enforcement, we can tick off every single thing that might be, critical of the police. But we also know how valuable the police are to our society. And it's very clear that in New York City, Mayor Adams supports his police. And that's refreshing. It's absolutely refreshing to have somebody who both understands it, was a cop, and supports it.
Pivoting back to your career now, you spent a number of years at Newsday. Now, Newsday used to have its offices in New York City. They don't have New York Newsday anymore, but their fabric in the city was there for a long time. They have their fabric firmly embedded in Long Island. And it's an interesting thing that goes together because so many cops and firemen, they live in Long Island, they work in the city. So whatever they're dealing with, it translates out there. There are volunteers out there 9 times out of 10, especially if they work in specialized units like emergency service, for example, or even the bomb squad. So as far as crime in the island, certain parts of the island, and how it translated to crime in the city, and as far as Newsday itself trying to compete in the city with these other 2 institutions, the Daily News and the Post, being there for what was a 7-year stint. Tell me about that, because I imagine you had to wear a lot of hats.
I tell you, Newsday, New York Newsday, a lot of people would say, it's a very liberal newspaper. I would say it's a wonderful newspaper. It gave you the time and the space to really dig into a story and find out what was actually going on. The New York Times had not yet won a Pulitzer Prize for local reporting when Newsday won its prize. Newsday won that prize because it was a subway crash and a fatal crash. Newsday followed every single element: the motorman, the cop, the passengers, the tracks, the train, the wheels on the train. They put a subway columnist on it. They put a team of police department reporters on it. Newsday allowed you to tell stories. And so the Happy Land, where I think 86 people lost their lives because a jealous boyfriend locked the back door to a club and started an arson fire and just killed all these people. Newsday was a place where reporters learned to do this thing that's different than something the Times does. Don't intellectualize the story. Put a bullseye on the story in terms of how does it feel? How does it feel to be the victim of the crime? How does it feel to be the police officer? How does it feel? And try and get to how a story feels. That's what Newsday did extraordinarily well. Now, when you're competing with the News and the Post, and if you ask anybody at the News and the Post, they had a much bigger circulation than Newsday, but people really paid attention to Newsday. Newsday had Sidney Schamberg, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who covered Vietnam and Cambodia for the New York Times, had Dennis Hamill, Jimmy Breslin, Murray Kempton. New York Newsday had a formidable staff of people. The editors of the newspaper were instrumental when they were younger in turning out how the new journalism was done. They worked at a paper back in the 60s, and they brought those skills to Newsday, where Jim Dwyer and Ellis Hennigan, they rode the subways every day, and they wrote a column about what they saw on the subway. And that was their job. They're a subway columnist. Jimmy Breslin, he was loved and hated, sometimes by the same person, sometimes on the same day. But he understood the way people think. And he understood cops in ways that, why do you move to the suburbs? Well, it's pretty hard to afford living in New York City on any salary, especially now, but then you want your kids to go to schools that are good. You're not responsible for making the school in New York City better, and you're not a racist or fleeing a city for wanting your kid to go to a better school. Police department now is about 57% people of color. And the younger they are, the more. Everybody wants their kids to have a good education. Everybody wants to have a nice house. Everybody wants to have a car. It's very tough on two middle-class salaries in New York City. Very tough to have that. So cops travel 80 miles to work. Firemen travel 80 miles to work. Reporters travel pretty far to work, or they live with another person. The reasons why people move are not complicated. Staten Island used to be a place where a lot of cops lived. Now Staten Island's getting expensive. Earlier, before you went on the air, you talked about Brian Hearn. Brian Hearn would tell stories at the bomb squad about what Staten Island was like when he was a boy. And, we'd all sit there and go, all right, Brian, yeah, there were acorns and there were horses and come on, we've been there. We know what Staten Island's like, but it sounds wonderful. Newsday's role in the city was to push those other papers to cover the institutions the way it covered them. So nobody could be lazy with Newsday around because they would dig into City Hall, whether it was David Dinkins and his stock deals or, a district attorney like John Santucci in Queens who spent 12 hours at lunch with a bunch of mobsters. And Newsday would put 3 reporters on that for 9 months until you got the story. Or Al Sharpton, who at the time, it's a real question at that point in Al's life, whether he was an FBI informant, whether he was involved in violent crime. Newsday dug into that. Everybody gets a chance in life to change, and Al's a different person now, but that's who he was then, and Newsday's the kind of paper that goes after that. So 7.5 years of a really wonderful experience with about 87 other reporters, almost all of us in the 5-year age range, just working as reporters together. Pretty great. And on Long Island, if you follow Newsday on Long Island, it does the job a newspaper should do, whether it's disparities in tax structures between certain neighborhoods and other neighborhoods, or, disparities in real estate and who allows people to live in their neighborhoods. These kinds of stories that are nitty gritty, simple stories that take a lot of shoe leather and a lot of computer and a lot of digging. Newsday's great at it, Times is great at it on a different level, but not when it comes down to the neighborhoods.
We're talking to Richard Esposito here on episode 186 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Again, I remind you, if you wish to contribute, if you want to, a super chat in the comments. You're more than welcome to do that. A quick shout out again to some other viewers who have tuned in since we have continued, and that's Jay Driscoll. He's here. I mentioned Sergeant Brian Coughlin of the Bomb Squad earlier. He's tuning in via LinkedIn. The Truth, a loyal supporter of this show. Joe Sanchez, retired NYPD officer. They called him the arrest machine in his day. Worked during these 60s and 70s, and also a Port Authority cop too, and retired NYPD lieutenant and author. Pete Pranzo. Thank you guys for tuning in this evening. So, I'll ask you, and it's funny, before I get to it, you had Lenny Levitt at Newsday. He came along later too, and I interviewed him a few years ago before he passed away, and I cherished that interview. I really do, because he had the great One Police Plaza column for many, many years. And one day he's walking in One Police Plaza, and the late, great Jack Maple says, "Lenny, how are your 3 readers?" Kind of poking fun at him. And Lenny told me this story. He's like, he shot back and said, "Well, Jack, they're doing fine, but here's a problem for you. Among those 3 readers, one of them is your boss, Bill Bratton, and one of the other readers is his boss, Mayor Rudy Giuliani." So, there is a little bit of scrutiny that a reporter can put on, not to be malicious, but to get to the core of the story, as you were saying just now, to show the city, what the city quality of life is like at that time, but also how its police department's operating. Where are our tax dollars going? How are they being used? It's important to know that, not as a gotcha, but as a means to tell, the important stories that the city is well served to know. So I guess that brings us to the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, when you went back to the Daily News for a period. And while you're there, something remarkable is happening. I just mentioned, Maple comes in from transit. Bratton comes in from transit. He had gone to Boston to run their police department for a year, but I think everybody would tell you he really wanted the NYPD job. And when Ray Kelly left, it opened up for him. So he comes in now, and this is the NYPD's version of the war years, and that it was going to be a long task, but they strapped up their boots, they had carte blanche, and now they're working to clean up the city, led by a man who firmly believes in what he's doing and instituted what's now known as the broken windows model. Covering that, when the city is changing, you can feel it, you can see it gradually, even though it's taking a while, crime is going down. How remarkable was it, given the quite frankly, the doldrums that the NYPD had been battling through the 70s with the Knapp Commission corruption, through the 80s with high crime, and really into the early 90s, right up until the Trade Center bombing in 93.
Well, let's start with Jack. Now, Jack Maple was a lightning rod. Some people, he was like the Jimmy Breslin of cops. People loved him, people hated him. And if he went into a precinct, a lot of people didn't like Jack, because Jack was in there, and he didn't use Bill Bratton's polished voice when Jack went somewhere, but he was the driver of the machine. He knew what it took to put the dots on the board and say, "Hey, crime is happening here in your precinct. Are you going to send anybody out there tomorrow and stop it? Because I would really like it if you stopped it. And if you don't stop it, I would really like to ask you where you'd like to work tomorrow, because we're going to replace you." Jack was not a subtle guy, but he was a great guy. What Bratton was a true leader, a leader who can pick the people around him to solve the problem. There was sort of a malaise where it's like, it's always been this way and we can just do so much. And that was Bill's attitude was, no, we can do a lot. We're going to stop crime in New York. There were several 100,000 outstanding warrants when Bill Bratton and Jack Maple got these jobs, and John Miller came in and John Timoney. And Jack's solution was, hey, let's go and arrest. We have the right to go knock on every door of every person that's got a warrant. And when we knock on that door, we'll give them a choice. We'll drag you in on the warrant, or you tell us someone in this building who's got a gun, and then we'll take that person. And they got guns off the street. You know, the crack wars were going on. People were shooting each other on street corners over who was going to control the drug trade. There were guns everywhere. And under Bill Bratton, those guns came off the street. All of them, just about all of them. So gun crime just went down and down and down. These criminals went to jail. The things that people argue about, that, you know, it's jumping turnstiles. It's unfair to do that. Maybe you feel that way, but I feel that I'd like to ride the subway without people jumping over turnstiles while I'm trying to get through the turnstile. And by the way, kids now are doing it for sport. Everybody can get on the train. It's just a game at the moment. And it's a game that you shouldn't be playing because, the other 5 million people would like to get to and from work. And when the psycho sees this, Bill's correct. It sets a tone for the place. And his tone was law and order. So you can argue with the specifics of broken windows policing. You could say maybe we shouldn't do this way today, and maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe. But you got to do these things. You've got to, you must stop the little crimes just as much as hunt down the big criminals. So one of the things that was amazing was in the last year that I was a reporter, there were 2,200 and maybe 50. I'm off a few homicides in New York City. And then under Bill Bratton, you watch that number go down, not go down slowly, but 1,900. And by the time Ray Kelly came back, that number was low. And if you look at it now, I don't have the full numbers in front of me, but it's under 400 homicides for the year. You think about the difference between 2,200, 400, or 300. Think of the guns that are off the street. So it was on every level that Bill led the department, and he brought in people like Louis Anamone, chief of patrol, who did not shy from conflict. He brought in, John Timoney, who was a voice for the police department. But he had other commanders under these people who wanted to lead and wanted to stop crime. It didn't matter if they lived in Long Island, Rockland County, wherever. Their job in New York City was to stop crime, and Bill took that and put the pride back in. And he put the pride back in, and he made sure they got the tools, whether it was bicycles, new kinds of handcuffs, new radio cars, the proper weapons. Bill supported his cops, and Bill reduced crime in New York. And a famous moment in his career that defines him happened later in LA when he went to a neighborhood where there'd been a violent shooting and everybody was blaming the police. And Bill went there and he said, okay, I'd like to see the parents on the street with me. Where are you? Where is everybody in this neighborhood? Come here and stand here with me, and then let's blame me after we get this together. We got to do this together. And it was like nobody had ever called out the other people in the neighborhood and said, hey, we're not here alone. We're here for you, but with you. And Bill understood that. And if you watched Bill work the city as a politician, as a police leader, phenomenal. So the change in New York City during that administration is pretty unforgettable. The change in policing nationally, and I've heard all the sociological theories that it wasn't cops that did this, and it was birth rates, and it was this. And I'm sure all of these things had a part, but without guns, you stop shooting people. When crack dealers were off the street, people stopped getting addicted to drugs. And it wasn't magic, it was police work. And police work is tough. Brian Coughlin before he became a bomb guy, he was a pretty tough cop before, became a bagpiper and a bomb guy. And he could tell you.
Yeah, and you go down to one police plaza and look at the names from that time period. Sean McDonald, Kevin Gillespie, Tony Massimillo, Vinny Giudice, Tony Sanchez, Jerry Carter, Sean Carrington. These are the guys that were on the street that gave their lives in belief of that form of policing, that were willing to go down swinging, that were willing to lay it all on the line and give up everything at a moment's notice in firm belief of that kind of policing. And, it has yielded, unfortunately, those losses. But at the same time, one could look back at where the city was. And I remember talking about this with Chief Anamone, when he left in 1999, where the city was at the end of that decade alone compared to where it was in 1990, where there were 2,627 homicides. And one could be proud of the work that was done. So it wasn't all for naught, you know. And to your point earlier about the subways, you know, I see that, and this is a problem with social media now. Social media has just ruined everything. And Twitter, you know, you go on Twitter and they'd have you believe this is a good thing, jumping the turnstile, because people my age often say, well, public transportation should be free. And maybe it should. Maybe it should. You know, an argument can be made for that. That's a different discussion for a different day. But until it is, you have a Metro card, swipe it. It takes 2 seconds. No one's asking you to give over what you made in a week from your job to get on the train. It takes 2 seconds, maybe less if you're quick enough, to swipe it and get on. And as my friend Bill Cannon, who was a sergeant in anti-crime and later Manhattan North Homicide, often says on his show, Police Off the Cuff, most of the people that jump it can pay their fare. There's not that many people that, you know, it's a poor soul that just is low on his luck and low on his money. You can pay your fare. So I wanted to ask, you know, from really the middle of the 90s up until 2001, you took a hiatus from news. You were a CEO over in the private sector. Now, when you took that job, you know, it had been a long stretch for you of doing reporting on very important stories, but very difficult stories. Were you burnt out?
I wasn't burnt out. I was ready to do something new. I spent 17 years as a reporter and an editor. 17 years covering these kinds of stories. And I covered them every day, just like John Miller's built the same way. We went to everything. This wasn't let's sit by the phone, and it was like, let's get in the car and go see the mobster who got killed. Let's go look at the trunk of the car. Let's go to the house where a sister was murdered by her brother. Let's get into the courtroom and see, you know, what the person looks like and look in their eyes. 17 years of that's a long haul, for me anyway. And I wanted to see a different side of the world and the city. So I went to work for Time Warner as a senior vice president. And it was a whole new world. The head lawyer there, when I took the job, he said, just remember, now you're just another guy who's going to make some money in a company. You're not the guy riding the white horse in and saving people anymore. He was telling in his own way, that is what the world of business is like. But it was creative. We made records. We had, you know, whether it was Madonna, Nine Inch Nails, Nat King Cole's, Natalie Cole, you know, we made art. We had magazines. And I got a chance to do a different part of life. Remember, reporters are creative people. We're not automatons that just go out there, take a look. You know, writing's an art as well as a craft, and reporters, some become columnists like Breslin or Hamill. I wanted to try something new. So I went to Time Warner, then I went to work with the chairman, learning to build entertainment businesses. I traveled a lot to South Asia, learned to put together a rock and roll TV show, learned to start a small record business of my own. They said, why don't you just start one? Then you'll understand how this works. I was like, it's an expensive way to learn, but okay. You know, and we did, me and two other guys. And so I learned the business behind the creative world, how to read the balance sheets, how to look at the corporate structure, how to have a business strategy. And my boss said, look, he said, you know, in art, you have to be a genius. In the arts, you have to be excellent. He goes, in business, you know, you can be mediocre. And I was like, yeah, maybe I'm a mediocre businessman.
Fail upward, baby. Fail upward.
It's like, you know, it's like, okay, can I get a check for that? That's great. It was, I miss journalism. When 9/11 happened, I ran to my old newspaper. I got up that morning, worried about my kid. She was in school. And whatever else I had been doing for the last 5 years, that was over. I just ran to the Daily News, got myself into the building. Whoever was there, Bob Capstetter was there, a couple of other people were there. Until they had a staff that could get in, I said, I'll do whatever you need. Type, clean. I started at the bottom. I know how this works, whatever you need. I wrote for CNN that day. I filed for Reuters, all three organizations. And 2 days later, ABC called and said, in the way that assignment editors talk, and you know how they talk, it's like, hey, you want a piece of this story? It's like, you know, this is the biggest story of our lifetime, the biggest attack on American soil. how could I not want to work on this? So by September 13th, I had my press card again. I went down to get it, and the sergeant who was there said, it's great. There's a line of people who want press cards. It's going to take like a month for you to get a press card. I'm sorry. And then the chief of Manhattan detectives, Tom Fahey, showed up and he handed me my press card with my old pictures taped on it. She said, like I said, in just a few minutes, you'll have a press card. It pays to have friends and friends who are willing to help you out. And for, the next 17 years, I worked in TV news. And again, the blessing of the tragedy for me was I got to start in TV news at the bottom when I was over 40 years old. Nobody gets to start at the bottom when you're over 40 years old in network news. But one of my interns from the Daily News, one of the persons who became a young reporter for me, he was working as a producer for Fox. So I show up and he walks over, he goes, I know you know nothing about this. Don't worry, I will help you. I'll show you what a cable run is. I'll show you what a satellite hit is. You'll be fine. It was really wonderful, those 5 years in between. It's like a hinge, if you think about it, where I learned to talk to executives. I learned boardrooms. I learned corporate agendas. I learned a lot of things that prepared me for the next part of my career. But my career was in news and in writing, and I was thrilled to be back.
And around this time, you took on a project, and this we can get on the air now, as I promised we would. I want to thank you because there are two people that are pivotal to a miniseries I launched on this show that really changed the show. One of them is in the chat, Detective Bill Ryan of the Arson Explosion Squad. The other one's you, because when I graduated college, one of the gifts I got was a book I'd been trying to read for the longest time but couldn't get my hands on. And that was Bomb Squad: A Year Inside the Nation's Most Exclusive Police Unit, which allowed me in turn to get to know so many of the guys from the Bomb Squad: Kevin Barry, Jeff Oberdeer, Jim Carano, Paul Perricone, Brian Hearn, who'll be on the show this Friday, Brian Coughlin, who I know through LinkedIn, and so many other just great guys, Dan McNally, that I read about in that book. So here they are in 2004. They're coming off their 100-year anniversary. They started in 1903. It's a new time for them. They're getting a lot of cops coming in from emergency service in the spring of 2002. The Knucklehead Nine, as Jim Carano had called them. They're still trying to come to terms with 9/11, where they lost Dan Richards. What made you want to take on that project?
So right after 9/11, Nightline assigned me to cover Ground Zero. And I did 4 full episodes, half-hour episodes, about Ground Zero and about the Bomb Squad. The reason the Bomb Squad came into play was because 9/11 was a bombing, in a sense. So after 9/11, there were fears of a nuclear bomb possibly in New York. There were fears of other attacks. The NYPD very graciously let me go to work with the Bomb Squad. And we did these episodes of Nightline that were really could not have been done without the generosity of everybody in that squad, who made their lives available to us, whether it was personal, professional, and they let us stay in their squad rooms. Ted Gerstein and I, one of us was in that squad room just about every day. So this is before the book. We had gone to bomb school. They let us go down to Alabama to the Redstone Arsenal, and Ted and I spent about 2 weeks down there. So the U.S. Army and the FBI, they let us see what it takes to become a bomb technician. Later, during the writing of the book, I got to go and witness advanced post-blast school. My role in this was to pick up the pieces on the floor. I didn't do anything except, here, you go collect the stuff we blew up, kid, and put it in the bag. We'll show you how evidence is collected. It was clearly a story that needed to be told. And we were working for ABC. ABC is part of Disney. They also have a publishing company, Hyperion. And Hyperion said, hey, we've watched these TV pieces. Maybe somebody wants to do a book on this. I went down to public information when Michael Looney was DCPI, then a great guy. And I said, I'd like to do a book on this. We have a publisher who's interested. And I can assure you that it will be a positive book because these guys do a positive job. He got the approval of the police commissioner for me to do the book. Then I went to the bomb squad where they all had to buy in before we got an okay. So the whole squad decided whether we would be there or not. I think only one person didn't want us there. And later in the course of the book, he came up and said, you turned out to be a pretty good guy. And that was nice. But that's how we got there to the book by his unusual path. We did the TV shows, then we did the book. But the skill sets that these guys have, and you now know who they are pretty phenomenal.
Yes.
Whether it's lock picking, taking apart a hand grenade, opening a suitcase that has 5 different trips on it that could blow up, doing it in a 90-pound suit. When we went to bomb school, we got to put on that suit, and I'm like, how do these guys do it? You lose 5 pounds in 10 minutes walking in this suit. I did a 12-minute walk. And, there's some bomb technician who runs the marathon in that suit. Don't ask me how people can do this, but 12 minutes was enough for me. We became a part of their family. They really welcomed us. They shared their files going back 100 years. In their basement, they had all the material going back to Giuseppe Petrosini, and who was the first and only bomb technician killed overseas. People like Hearn, took us under their wing. People like they have, Lieutenant Torrey, who runs the bomb squad, educated us in many ways. But the most important thing is they told us their own stories. They told us about their lives. We understood how their families took it. Remember, behind every one of these people is a family. So every person that goes out and stands in front of a bomb has a wife, a daughter, a son, a brother, wondering, I hope Brian or, Mark comes back tomorrow, because this thing can blow up. You've seen pictures of bombs blowing up on 23rd Street, right? A bomb blew up. Bomb blew up in Central Park a few years ago. The suit will protect you. Sometimes you don't have it on. Sometimes the bomb is too big. So my own daughter, when we would go out on these jobs, one night she lived with me 2 weeks of the month, and she said, "Hey, Pop, you're going to leave me here. How do we know you're going to come back?" And I said, "Well, I don't stand over the bomb. I stand behind the guy that stands over the bomb. So I'll be fine. Don't worry. I'll be back later." But just think of what their families risk. Every cop's family takes a risk. Yeah. Every firefighter's family, journalist families take risks. You can see what's happening in Ukraine. Reporters are getting killed. But they let us see how their families felt. And the guys who had retired already, whether it was, Senf or Pastorella, they showed us their injuries, how they got their injuries, what it felt like. We talked to their sons, their families. It was a pretty amazing year for Ted Gerstein and I to, journalists don't get a year, and they shared everything, good, bad, and different. As you know, you read the book. It's not like they didn't tell us things that weren't going well. They did. And it was an amazing experience.
And I love how the book went back in time. You went back to 1993, and that's how I first learned of Don Sadawi, and everything he went through in that investigation, how the FBI wanted him thrown off the case. And I tell you, and you really drove it home with this. You broke my heart when you wrote about what they went through on 9/11. The part in the book that I get goosebumps every time is Steve Burbridge sitting in the corner in the squad room after 9/11, where he suffered a horrible injury that day. A piece of rebar flew through his knee, bawling his eyes out that he just lost Danny. I mean, that part really tugged at my heartstrings. I'm feeling it now as I'm talking about it. I'm getting a little emotional because, You go to that wall, and there's 6 memorial plaques up there, and this is the part that was so real and raw for me. 2 years, 3 years afterwards, or most of the members of the squad were in the squad on that day. It's not just the remnants of that day. It's looking at the memorial plaque and the remnants of him and not having him there. And there was a simple tribute to him in that locker room that it was just an empty locker. No special tributes. He was a modest man, just an empty locker that told him, as I think Kevin Barry said in the book, when he died that day, a piece of every single one of us died with him. And I think Joe Patowski talked about having a dream where he comes in and checks his son's classroom. They were really feeling it. And how would you not? He was the heart and soul of that unit.
He was, an Army Ranger before he became a New York City police officer. His whole life was service. And that locker, he had a little rug on the floor of his locker, so it was neat, squared away, just like him. He didn't question why he had to run into that building. It wasn't, and other bomb technicians ran in and did come out, as you said, rebar injury, somebody else got hit with a piece, somebody didn't know if they would get out. Danny just didn't come home. And nobody, the firemen that went in, the Port Authority police who were trapped in there, each of these stories is an incredible story. For the bomb squad, it's 33 people. That's the whole squad, small, tight unit. Danny ran in and Danny didn't come back. And it left a hole in that squad. It took a life out, and that would never come back. And it took a little piece of everybody in there. And, nobody had died in that squad in many years.
25.
Brian Murray. And then before that, the 40s. And before that, another 40 years. Danny died when the explosion had already occurred. A plane drove into a building. Danny ran in there to save lives. That's what he did. He went in there to get people out. He knew that's what a policeman did. And I get choked up when I think about it. Because that's what he meant to that squad, Yeah.
Jeff Oberdier told me, he's like, he didn't go down there as a bomb tech. He was a cop in him. It had nothing to do with the bomb squad. They were just police officers that day. I mean, I talked to Joe Dolan off the air, and hearing his story of what he went through that day, same thing. Mike O'Mixon in that book was very fortunate to be here. And I remember Joe telling me when he came back to the squad, because he had gone to the 6th precinct to pick up Dan McNally, Steve Burbridge, and Dan Richards and bring them back down to the Trade Center. He saw Michael Mixon in there, and Mike was cleaning the dust off him. And Mike just turned to him matter-of-factly and said, "I thought you were dead." And unfortunately, and Brian will talk about it on Friday when he comes on, somebody in the squad was indeed gone. And the last note on that, when Don was on this show, I think 4 or 5 days after Danny died, they went down to his apartment because he lived in Greenwich Village, so he could walk to work. It was Dennis Mulcahy, Jim Carano, Sergeant Tony Bondolillo, who I'm trying to get on this show, and a couple other guys, I think. But those 3 guys I know were there. And Danny, before he left, had his detective shield on his last will and testament. So he knew. But he went out that door anyway. And, what can you say about that? We talk about ball players being heroes. The Rangers just won Game 7 last night, and I'm happy about that as a Ranger fan. Oh, he's the hero of the day. He scored the big goal. He made a nice play, yeah. That's a hero. That's a hero.
Yes. Sports is entertainment. Sports is wonderful. It takes place in a small arena for big dollars. We love it. We enjoy it. After 9/11, there was a threat of a nuclear bomb that might have been in New York, a dirty bomb. A group of retired bomb technicians, talk about heroes, they volunteered because they felt their children were grown, their grandchildren were born. If somebody was going to die, better me than some young guy. They volunteered for that. Charles, who was an inspector at the time, he was in 1980 the man who took apart with a pocket knife one of the bombs by the Puerto Rican Liberation Army. Now, he was in charge of a task force to make sure that were there a dirty bomb, It didn't go off in New York. 21 years of doing difficult jobs, and he was ready to deal with that one. The heroism didn't stop that day. Remember 1993, 2001, what's next? They are there every day. They have plans to respond in every borough. When there's the Fleet Week, they're there on the docks making sure the ships are safe, coordinating with the Navy security. When there's the Israeli Day Parade, Tony Biondolillo took me to the celebration, of Israel. Every FedEx package left in front of every store on Fifth Avenue was checked. They ran from package to package. They took not a single chance that anything would happen to anyone. New Year's Eve, Brian Hearn cleared a path through the middle of Times Square with his dog. People were cheering to see the bomb squad walking through and making sure they were safe. They don't run, they walk to danger. It's not the book was there to tell their story. It's not at the expense of anybody else's story. I want to be clear. There are many incredible stories to tell. This is the one that Ted and I chose to tell. And in fact, Brian Ross, who was on your show at the New Year's, Brian and I are working on another project about bomb technicians. The people who build bombs, the people who protect us from bombs, and the people who hunt down the bombers. That's a project we're working on now. We think, we'll try and do 10 episodes on it. It'll be beyond New York. It'll expand to other jurisdictions, England, overseas, Israel. All these guys know each other, by the way. If you go talk to the New York bomb squad, they know the guy in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Jordan. They are a very tight-knit network of people. If a bomb goes off somewhere, New York will have a picture of it. Nobody's waiting for it to go to Washington and come down. Their colleagues know they need that now, and it gets to them right away. Great experience. That's kind of how we got there. We got there through the good fortune of being trusted by the police and given the access that it takes to tell those kind of stories. I'm glad you read it, because those history stories are the other part of the story,
Oh, of course, and I appreciate that, because it spawned other, like at the end of the book, and this helped me too. There's the roster of guys, not every name, but most of the guys that have been in the squad over the years. One job that wasn't mentioned in there, but I found out about, was the job in Brooklyn in 1997 on 4th Avenue, I believe, which was 2 Hamas terrorists looking to bomb the Atlantic Avenue subway. That's how I met, at least through the computer and doing the show, Paul Yercoon, Rich Teamsma, and Eddie Hayes. So I was able to get to know those guys, and now all 3 of those guys are friends of mine, and they've all been on this show. I'm going to have Paul and Richie back for that job in August, along with some other guys, hopefully Joe Dolan and Jeff too. So it's a great look at their history, and I think, as I said in the introduction, last note on it, it is the definitive account of that unit. Other books have been written. You did television specials on it. Other people have done television specials too. You've never seen these guys like that before. Not just the work, but as you highlighted so beautifully, the human side too.
It was an honor to work with them. I'm still involved. I'm an advisor to their association. I read scholarship applications, look at their magazine and make a suggestion now and then. I go to conferences because they asked me to do something for them. And after what they did for me, how could I not say, of course I'll be there? So, there's over 5,000 bomb technicians, investigators, arson and explosion people. They all belong to this association. And it's a pretty amazing group of people. Nothing like going to a convention where somebody says, do you need any C4? Because I have some in my,
Lovely everyday conversations. But I moving ahead, and the hour's just flown by. It's been great. Hour 10 now. You did work in DCPI for a while with the NYPD, so you did do the other side of reporting too, from the media there. I remember when I interviewed John, he talked about how in '94, when he first became the DCPI, his reporter colleagues were kidding him that he was going over to the dark side. So, you had your own experience working at 1PP, and now you're and other endeavors. So what are you doing now? What are you up to these days?
Well, yeah. Well, first, like when I got there at 1PP, I said, John, all our lives, people accused us of being pro-cop reporters. Now I'm here, and it's like they think I'm a communist. These guys, it's like, do we never get a break, you and I? What I'm doing now, I left the PD. It's not been that long, mid-February. I had a wonderful 2 years, just an incredibly intense 2 years, but I learned a lot. I am writing a book about Jimmy Breslin. I'm writing a biography on Jimmy, which hopefully I'll get finished in time because it's scheduled to be published next year. I'm working on a TV show with Brian, and I'm doing consulting for companies in the areas that I have some expertise. So I'm on the board of advisors for a company that is doing the next advance in DNA deconvolution. It's a company called Mixolydian. What it does is it takes probability out of the equation and gets you right to this is definitely this DNA. And crime scenes are dirty. You've seen them. DNA samples are small and dirty. Let's say it's a rape. There's the victim, the rapist, the husband or girlfriend, whatever was on the sidewalk. All of this has to be deconvoluted to get to the end. So I'm on the board of a company that does that. Working with a couple of companies that do biometric stuff and encrypted collaborative writing platforms. I'm pretty busy, believe it or not. I'm working with a financial tech company. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of things. It's a practice. It's not a firm, and it's meant to stay small. It gives me the freedom to write books. It gives me the freedom to work on a show with Brian Ross. And I get to, again, I'm working with people who are really interesting and who are on the cutting edge of their own sectors. And a lot of it's in the law enforcement, homeland security arena, which is, or journalistic, like some of these platforms can use either way. So it's kind of great. As I tell my wife, Karen, I'm not sure if this is the path, but it's certainly the current part of the path. It's where I am right now, and it's fun. But just before you go, DCPI has got to be next to being city editor at 30-something years old, where you live and breathe. You never leave the office, and if you do leave, they call you. And if you forgot to get there, it's nonstop. DCPI is nonstop. They want someone with a lot of experience for a young man's game. Yes, you can, so John and I, are middle-aged guys, and you need the energy of a young guy and the breadth of experience of an older guy. It is busy, creative, amazing, and you really get to see both the good reporters and the not so good reporters, and the reporters who care about their work and the reporters who, maybe not so. So, it opens your eyes up to the profession in which you spent your career from another side. And you get to see biases and prejudices from another side. So it was a fabulous 2 years. We had COVID that took a big hit. Crime was going up. We had national protests. There was a lot going on. So I didn't want to finish up without just realizing I was so grateful to the police department for giving me that opportunity. It was just fantastic,
Well, we're not going just yet, and the reason why we're not going is because
good.
It's time for the rapid fire. five hit run questions for me.
Huh? Okay.
Yeah, I had to add this in at the end for sure. 5 hit run questions for me, 5 hit and run answers from you. Are you ready?
Yeah.
First, and you can say pass if you want. There's a lot of heavy stories as we covered tonight. Funniest story you ever covered?
Funniest story I ever covered, and I thought about this a little bit. There was a newspaper dealer back when people sold newspapers and they hawked them on the street and said, extra, read all about it. And Sam Roberts was the city editor of the Daily News, and he said, go interview this newspaper dealer. He's down on Wall Street, and he shouts out the headlines like it's 1940, and go find out. So I went on, I interviewed this guy. His name was Firpo. Firpo was the name of the boxer who knocked Jack Dempsey out of the ring. And if you've ever seen that painting of it, and so there I was interviewing Firpo the newsie, and I just laughed, got in the paper, and probably the last newsie of his kind, but named after the guy who did the knockout punch on Dempsey. And it wasn't ha-ha funny, as they say, but it was funny. Just an amazing tale of New York,
Only in New York, of course. Second, if you could interview. Exactly. Second, if you could interview anyone dead or alive, who would it be and why?
That is a tough story. I had to pick two people: Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy. There are questions that I'm sure historians want to ask of Kennedy about, Vietnam, about the Great Society. There are questions, Churchill, when the moment was big, he was a great success. When the moment was small, not so good, And those are two people who I really would love to interview. I mean, I would just really wish that you could do that,
Yeah. Third, best advice anyone ever gave you?
Read to the end of the document and don't stop till you finish it. Read the appendix, read the whole thing, and don't ever stop before then. That's the best advice. It's in there somewhere. Don't give up until you find it,
Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
That's not a good question. So, there was Elaine's when she was open. There's, Campagnola, where we later went when we had a little, cash in our pockets. I go downtown by City Hall and Police Headquarters. There's the Odeon. It's just a wonderful place. I don't know anybody there, but I go once a month. They make a great steak and French fries. I take my daughter. She and I just love to go. Those are just, and then there's Chinatown, where I can tick off 3 restaurants right now that I would be happy to go to with you tomorrow morning. It's just being one restaurant in New York. I just can't do that.
That's fine. You can say multiple because there's so many different cuisines. Yeah. If you want, I'm half Dominican, half Puerto Rican. If I want some rice and beans, with some chuletas, I work for pork chops. I can go to the 6 different neighborhoods off the bat, to get it. Washington Heights, there you go. Which is where some of my family is. So fifth and finally, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, besides read the document to the very end, of course, what advice would you give a younger version of Rich Esposito?
Listen. That's it. We're always ready to ask a question. It really pays to listen to the answer. It's a hard skill, actively listening. It took a long time for me to learn it. It's not the tape recording. It's not just the notebook. Listen. That's the thing that's the other thing that I would advise a young reporter, because listen and you'll learn. You'll just learn. And it takes time to learn to listen. It really does. So that would be the other thing that I would say.
This has been wonderful. Stick around. Don't sign off yet. We'll say goodbye off the air after a debrief.
Great.
But before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs you want to give to anyone or anything?
No, I mean, it's great that Brian Coughlin is there listening. I'm thrilled. I've already given a sort of shout out to John Miller, who's a great friend, and he's got like 3 hats he's wearing now, including my old hat. I'm amazed we're still talking, that now that he's inherited my job. Mm-hmm. Whether it's in law, and I should probably give a shout out to my daughter and my wife who let me do this like every day, go play in traffic and have a good time,
Shout out to them for them letting me steal you for a little bit. Shout out to the audience as always. Of course, you mentioned Brian Coughlin, Joe Sanchez, Steven Zaslavsky, Jay Driscoll, Bill Ryan, Mark Mulitz, D Truth. I think I mentioned Lieutenant Pranzo, Joe Maliga, who tuned in tonight as well. Thank you guys. And Raquel Pranzo, the better half of Lieutenant Pete Pranzo. Thank you guys for tuning in. tonight. So coming up next on the Mike to New Haven podcast, he was one of the guys that you chronicled in your book. Of course, we mentioned him earlier for volume 23 of Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's arson, explosion, and bomb squad. Retired NYPD bomb squad detective Brian Hearn will be here. 16 of his 27 years were spent in the bomb squad, the previous 8 emergency service. So a full plate in his career. And this Friday at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, he'll tell me all about it. In the meantime, on behalf of Rich Esposito, I am Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Have a great night, everybody. Let's go Rangers.